hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me.
When we think of our life with the Messiah, what comes to mind?
Well, we should recognize that he is our life. Without him, we were dead in our trespasses and sins. We have the foretaste of the blessings. We have fellowship. We have just the joy, a heart that loves the Scripture.
All because of Messiah?
What's that?
All because of Messiah?
All because of Messiah.
Yeshua, Messiah, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, yo. It's Wednesday, December 5th. This is Messiah Matters number 244. I'm sitting on the beach somewhere in Cali. My name is Caleb Haig.
And my name's Rob Vanup, and I'm digging that baritone line there. Burn it.
Yep.
It's like so tasteful.
Yeah, that's good.
A lot of space. Like he just burn it.
It gets even better, too.
Yeah, man. That is just Caleb, I just got to say 2 thumbs up on selecting our new intro music. I know we've got some sweet outro music.
Well, it's the same music. It's just the end
I love a killer
of it.
horn section, and that is a really nice, tight arrangement there.
Well, I didn't do it. I didn't make it. I mean, I made the first part.
Whoever those musicians are.
Yeah.
Is that okay? I could be fooled. I know that the samples are so high quality, but that sounded like that sounds like a legit horn section. What do you think? Is that all just programmed? I mean, can you tell?
It's hard to tell. Whoever did it so well that it's hard to tell.
Yeah, I mean, either way, it's a legitimate arrangement.
No
if
doubt.
That is just sampled horns, or if that's legit performance. The good samples come from real performance, so we know that. But no matter how you dice it, that still had to be arranged.
Oh yeah, yeah. Whoever did it did a fantastic job. Yeah, we're happy to see the people who. There's whole companies now that create music and then sell it.
Good on them, man.
And you know what? They're making a living doing it, I'm sure. And good musicians found a niche. And we are the people that are that are buying it. A big thank you to Christian Parks for supplying the funds to create such an intro. Good on you, brother. We appreciate it fully. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, anyone who watched last week's show and is now watching this week's show notices that we're wearing the exact same clothes. In fact, we just did last week's show about an hour ago, and now
I was going to say we got in a time machine and we moved. Yes. We just, like Bill and Ted, just changed. This
is pre-recorded, and we're sorry for that because it's always nice to have the chat room to give the comments and whatnot. But that's okay. We're working with what we got. My wife and I are in California right now, enjoying some much needed vacation with our family, with our children, and extended family as well. And we are using the time to pray and to brainstorm about some of the things that we believe the Lord is moving us into, and we will have more information on that as the weeks progress and as we start to put things together. We've actually been working for several months now on some ideas, and actually our listeners, I know that people heard me talk about my son and doing a show with him. That is still in the works. My wife and I are working all that into what we're doing, and so actually I got some Bobby Walters, who works for Chosen People Ministry in New York. He gave me some good ideas, too, when we were at the ETS. He was at the ETS, the Evangelical Theological Society, and he said, hey, I heard you were talking about, doing a kid's show, and here's some ideas I have. And so he gave me some ideas that actually kind of made me totally rethink how I was going to do the show.
Cool.
And I think it's going to work well because I think he was talking about attention span of children who are 5 and 6 years old. And he's right. For something like Bubble Guppies or Paw Patrol, or what the kids are watching these days, attention span can be 24 minutes. However, with something about theology and or the Bible, especially when you're talking about a talk format, I think that attention span narrows quite down. So, yeah. All right. So keep your eyes and ears open for that. Okay. So we got we still got a ton to talk about. And for those who might not, for our supporters, we should have something up. So we're going to record something for Messiah Matters More. So you can go and check that out. I'm not sure what we're going to do yet. We'll find something, and we'll talk about that. So in the past day, Rob Van Hoff has been asked twice on two separate occasions about the same passage.
Yeah, I doubt the people are on each other's radar, that sort of thing.
Sure.
And actually, to be fair, one of the emails I actually received before our Denver adventure, so I was actually catching up with email, and then the same day a fresh one came in.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, on the John 1:1, I'll open it here so I can share. But the idea is, and Caleb, I'm thinking we probably talked about this before.
Well, I'm sure we probably have.
One of them was one of the emails I received had to do with specific interaction with Jehovah's Witnesses. The other email I got didn't mention Jehovah's Witness. It was a Messianic teacher that is just out there teaching. They didn't cite the Jehovah's Witness, but using the same argument to say that Yeshua is somehow a mighty one, right? They want to say he's an Elohim, but he's not like Ha Elohim.
Not
right?
Yeah, exactly. Not the
and
God.
So they're trying to
he's a God, but not the
this,
God. Right.
the three persons of the Godhead or something like that.
Can I ask you this? Outside of Jehovah's Witnesses, do you think that this same debate, because we see it, this logical, like this line of thinking is really prevalent right now in the Hebrew roots movement, right? But
it seems,
but is that paralleled in the mainstream Christianity realm? I mean, the mainstream Christianity, let's be honest, mainstream Christianity thinks that the Hebrew roots movement is totally out to lunch. And in a lot of ways, they might be right. Okay. This case in point right here. Okay. So, but I wonder if we're seeing a rise of the same kind of theological
it seems like
missteps.
Things just kind of circle around, don't they? And then they come back in style. Is there just an element of,
maybe I'm totally ignorant, but outside of the Messianic or outside of the Hebrew roots realm, when I was attending a mainstream Christian church, and I still attend, people might be surprised to hear this, but I go to different Christian churches probably about 2 to 3 times a month. So on Sundays, usually the beginning of my Sunday morning is going to church somewhere, and I choose a different, sometimes I go to the same churches and try to meet people, and sometimes I go to different churches. But this is not something that I've encountered within the mainstream Christian church. Now, it might be my area. It might be the churches that I'm going to. We're blessed in the area. I live in Tacoma, Washington. We're very blessed that we have about 250,000 people in Tacoma. And it's extremely liberal. It's an extremely liberal place. But within the extremely liberal swath of people here, there are some really good churches, pastors that teach. Rob Rayburn. Now, I don't agree with these people. Rob Rayburn is Presbyterian. So obviously I'm going to disagree with some of his theology. But he is a dynamite teacher. Nate Corley at Fellowship Bible Church is another fantastic, and Bruce Stabbert there as well. I mean, you got teachers who are a cut above the rest when it comes to good Christian preaching within Tacoma. So I can go to these different churches and I can hear really good, theologically strong sermons. So maybe that's one of the reasons that I'm not hearing these kind of debates within Christianity. But it would be interesting to see if this is plaguing, if this debate of whether or not Yeshua is Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, whether or not he's deity, whether or not he's God, is plaguing the Christian communities as it is the Hebrew roots communities. Anyway, keep going. Sorry.
I don't know. I wonder in some instances where you have a stronger traditional confessional denomination, right? Where you have, in other words, here's our basic doctrines, that sometimes that does the filtering work. So the people inside those circles, they've already, you know, the people who would question these, bring these kind of questions have already been filtered out. They're not even going to probably come in to the church. But I don't know. I mean, obviously the Jehovah's Witnesses to this day are going door to door, and they're continuing to share. I came across a last week's show, you shared about coming across the rabbi thing in the margin of the Steve Vai video you found. Right. I think I was watching the same clip that you posted, and in the column was a Jehovah's Witness comes to a black Israelite door. And so you got these dudes are like trying to tell the Jehovah's Witness lady about who is Israel, right? And then that led me on a rabbit trail of the Black Israelite movement, and I think we've talked about that a little bit. Somebody
recently, actually, it was at ETS. Somebody was like, "Hey, have you guys thought about talking about the Black Israelite movement? Like, because there's some representatives in Tacoma," and I was like, "We're not touching it. We're not touching. You know, like, no. Okay, yeah. Keep going. So John 1.
John 1. So that takes us to, I should open it up in my Bible here. Let me just, if anybody's interested in joining us, we're looking at the Gospel of John, chapter 1, right at the beginning here. And this is not always, in my experience, I've talked to many Jehovah's Witnesses, so this has not always been a go-to, but in times it has been. And they bring it up. And I had one elderly Jehovah's Witness give me he came back later, and he really liked the conversation, and he gave me a interlinear Greek. I don't think I have it anymore. It might be at Heart of Messiah Library, but it's it's New World. I think they call it the New World translation, but with the interlinear Greek. So it's supposed to help.
Did you speak Greek at the time?
Oh yeah, I had a little bit of Greek at the time. So here's the claim here is that John 1:1, which I'll read in Greek, it's en arche, so that's in the beginning, right. Ein halagos, so was halagos, ha being the definite article, the word. Kai halagos ein prostontheon, which means, and the word was with God, or face to face with God, however you want. This proston is a pros plus accusative, has a certain meaning. We'll say with is fine. And then it says kai theos ein halagos, and theos was the word. And what they'll notice here is that we have 3 times the word logos in verse 1. So John 1 verse 1. And logos occurs 3 times, and each time it has a definite article. The word, halagos, halagos, halagos. 2 times we have the word theos, which is the word that translates Elohim. And what they'll point out is, well, the first occurrence where it says the word was with God, it says proston theon. So ton is our definite article. So all 3 times we have logos, it has a definite article. The first occurrence of the word theos, or Elohim, or God, has the definite article. But in that last clause, and the word was God, there's no definite article, theos. It just says, and so they say there's a distinction that needs to be made here by the word theos, or God, used at the end of John 1:1 from the use of the word theos, or God, in the middle of the verse. Because in Greek, the first one there has a definite article, like all the logos do, but this last one does not. And with that, they say, therefore, it needs to be translated with a lowercase g. So I don't have it in front of me, but if you had a New World translation, if you looked online, I think it says, so in the beginning was the word was with God, and the word was a God.
Right.
So they have a God with a lowercase g. And the rationale is that there's no definite article on the word God there in the Greek, therefore it must mean
It's not the God,
lowercase.
it's just
Yeah.
God is their argument. Yes, okay.
Well, there's so many ways to tackle this, but here's a real easy one. I'll give two. And Daniel Wallace, I think, will do a good job. He's addressed this. I know in our first year Greek grammar, he has a little section that Dr. Mounts includes that is written by Dr. Wallace, Dr. Daniel Wallace, addressing this John 1:1 issue and the Jehovah Witness claim. So if you take first year Greek, you run into this anyway. But what 2 points that I just want to hammer out today that I hope will be helpful. The first one is the use of the definite article in Greek is not the same as it is in Hebrew or even in English. For example, here's just a great example. A definite article in Greek can be in front of a name. You'll often see it in front of a name. It would be like the Caleb.
Right.
The Caleb said this to the Rob. And that doesn't translate well in our world.
Right.
We wouldn't, even in Hebrew, you wouldn't say ha Yeshua, right? Or ha Moshe,
Right.
you wouldn't say it with the name of the person. So the use of the definite article in Hebrew, the use of what we call the definite article in Greek, and the use of the definite article in English are not coextensive with each other. We have to remember that each of these languages represents has a whole culture and a way of using language that needs to be differentiated from one another.
Right.
So it's not so simple that what the JWs want to do is import or project their English conception of the definite article and insisting that the Greek upholds the meaning that they're assuming from their English reading. Okay, so that's one. But here's a fun one, and this is the one I shared in the emails, was if you look, for example, okay, let's just say that's true. If there's no definite article on the word theos, then it must be lowercase g, or a God. And if we just continued to read in John 1, we'd encounter some funny things, like in 1:6, where it says there was a man sent from God, where it's talking about John the Baptist. It says you would have to, because there's no definite article,
right?
You'd say there was a man sent from a God, lowercase g, whose name was John.
Right.
Okay, I mean, that doesn't make sense. Well, which God? The true God?
Right.
Like, why do I care? Another one would be verse 12. It says, for as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of it's just tekna theou. There's no definite article. Right. Children of a God. To those who believe in his name, who are born not of the blood or the will, nor blood, nor the will of flesh, or the will of man, but of a God, lowercase g. Right? And then here's a funny one. If you could even take this all the way into chapter 3, where Nicodemus comes to Yeshua at night and he says, Rabbi, we know you have come from
a God.
Yeah, a God, lowercase g. So the point is, you can find example after example, and you could, I haven't gone through the New World translation of John to see how they do this, but I can't imagine that they're going to uphold this insistence on all these other cases, because it would be nonsense. It's nonsensical. So there are now, aside from those 2 points, just the need to differentiate use of what we call the definite article in these different languages, Hebrew, Greek, and English. The second point, I think, just these examples of where we would see nonsensical translations if we really held to that standard. But the third, and this gets into Greek, if you take first year Greek, is the construction of sentences. And this is where Dr. Wallace gets into the nuts and bolts. It wouldn't be appropriate in simple Greek grammar to have a definite article there in 1 verse 1. Long story short, bottom line, Caleb, is, and for our audience, is don't let anybody, disturb your heart on this John 1:1.
Don't be bamboozled.
The good old NASB. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. I think that's probably the King James. I mean, pretty much, it's the same. I believe in the capital W here and the capital G. That's awesome rendering into English. And then, of course, the core, and this touches on a little bit about what we talked about last week with, we listened to the rabbi talk about incarnation. Well, John 1:1, it says the Word became flesh. And this is that's a mystery, but that's the truth. That's what happened. That's where our redemption comes from. Our redemption came from someone who's from God, but someone outside of the sin problem came into the middle of where the fire was in the house and all the problem, and he rescued us.
Right.
He came from outside, rescued us, and saved us. And that's not a fake thing. That's a very real thing. And it was necessary. God didn't do that just because it was one of the options of many. He did it because this was the plan of redemption from the beginning.
I want to move on. I want to move on to we actually got a voicemail today, and actually for when this airs, it will have been a week ago. I don't believe the young lady left her name, which is fine, but she asked a really good question. We've touched on tattoos a little bit here and there, but we've never really given any opinion. And my cursory knowledge of Hebrew is such that I lean on the scholarship of people like Rob and my father to be able to help me navigate through some of the more nuanced.
Is this like a Deuteronomy 14 kind of thing?
Well, this is Leviticus 19:28.
Or Leviticus 19:28, I think.
So here's the verse in the ESV. So basically, the person's question was, the young lady's question was, do you believe that tattoos are wrong or not? And she said, I'm not thinking about getting a tattoo. However, in the times that we live in, I'm wondering if, I'm just wondering what your opinion is. So in the ESV, it reads, you shall not make any cuts on your body for the dead or tattoo yourselves. I am the Lord. So that's the ESV. Now in the Hebrew, I don't know my Hebrew well enough to be able to break this down. I think this is I'll give you the understanding that I have of this passage, and then you can slaughter it with the with the Hebrew. It's my understanding that this is a little bit ambiguous as to whether or not the tattooing is a reference back to the dead, or if it's just in general. So in other words, you shall not make any cuts on your body for the dead. And I know that it's interesting. I was reading the Hebrew before we came on air, and it's really interesting because it's lenephesh, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, yeah. Anyway, so you shall not make any cuts on your body for the dead or tattoo yourselves. So is it tattoo in general, or is it tattoo for the dead? In other words, is it a reference back to the prohibition of doing something in honor of the dead? That's the way that I've understood the passage.
Yeah, I take it as, well, if we go to the 1928, because I pulled up the parallel, which is Deuteronomy 14:1, and it seems to be similar. To the 1928, it does use the word ketovet, which is like the NASB translates that as tattoo, because it's from the word katav, to write.
Right.
So,
but it's actually to mark, right?
Or yeah. So but again, and to be fair, this is how I would research this, and I haven't done. My personal opinion is don't get a tattoo. If you got a tattoo at some point in your past, I would say, don't worry about it. If it's possible to maybe to remove it. I don't know what that entails. That's my sense. Does that mean that because that's my sense that necessarily I must insist that Leviticus 19:28 is saying what my internal sense is?
We'll talk about that in a second.
I can't say. But what I would do, here's the fair way, I think, to lay it out, is you would first research what do we know about the concept we have about tattoos today, where you go down to the parlor, and they have all these, they inject, they got a book. What? They
got a book. You choose the unicorn flying over the rainbow with kittens on it or something.
Well, and there's, there is a kind of cutting, right? I mean, it's a piercing of the skin,
right,
repeatedly with a certain kind of ink that is designed to stay, and so it's a deliberate marking. It seems that, a couple things. One is that slaves might have been marked as property in the ancient world generally. So that's one area that would be maybe helpful to research.
Sure.
We don't have any indication of in the Torah when a person is in indentured servant, or we'd say a slave for so many years, but they want to stay. The mark is the impaling the ear, right? Marking the ear lobe, apparently.
Real quick, give me the Deuteronomy passage. What was the Deuteronomy passage?
14. Yeah, the beginning of chapter 14.
14 what? 14?
1 and 2. I think.
Got it.
The idea is remaining, is not in there, is not being like these other nations, right? That you belong to God. And so this gets to this slavery issue. So if we, to kind of continue on that path and jump from the Leviticus to the Deuteronomy, it says, Banim atem l'Adonai Elohechem. You are children unto Adonai your Elohim.
In other words, you belong to God.
Yeah, well, and not only, but because he calls them servants, but they're also called sons. And so there's this familial language is bookends this commandment not to mark your bodies in certain ways. And then it says, Ki am kadosh ata l'Adonai Elohecha. That's verse 2. And you, Adonai, chose to be his separate people. So the idea is there's a kinship that God is wanting to convey. You have to think of yourself as a peoplehood, and you belong to him. You have a father in heaven. And because of this, there's a way we treat our bodies
that's different.
Yeah. Well, of course, circumcision would be one way where you could say, well, that's cutting the skin, right? Well, that's commandment. And of course, that goes back to Abraham. And some have argued that the circumcision was could be viewed in an academic kind of exploration as a kind of slave brand. In other words, and that's not entirely crazy, because we know in the Second Temple era, right. I don't remember which Maccabean king, but they got they started lusting after these other land territories, and they wanted to extend their power, and so they moved into Idumea and a couple other places and forced circumcised all the males and said, "You're now Judean. You now pay us taxes." It wasn't about religion,
right?
It was about money. Marking. We go through. We mark all your males,
right?
And now your identity has shifted, and now you have political and financial
obligation.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's not entirely crazy. Now, of course, we see very clearly, as Paul would say, this is a total hijacking and corruption of the concept of Brit Milah, right? Of the covenant with Abraham. And because it totally misrepresents the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in this. Although it tries to, it's kind of like a kidnapping of a commandment in a way, and using it for
that happens all the time, though. That happens all the time.
Yeah. So, but back to this though. So if we allowed ourselves to read Deuteronomy 14, 1 and 2 as a kind of capsulization of this familial language that God wants his people to learn to think of themselves as, and this is Yeshua himself, right? Our Father, right? Why does the prayer begin, Our Father?
Right.
It's because we're identifying with this people group here, and there's a way we are to honor and treat our bodies with honor and dignity, purity, cleanliness, etc. All these things. So now again, if you got a tattoo and now you're like, yeah, I wouldn't get one now, I would say, don't worry about it. But what my concern is for the people in like the Christian world, evangelical world, that seem to have a boast, and I've met them, and I'm not making this up. I've known people that have boldly gone out and gotten tattoos thinking that they're going to this somehow is going to advance kingdom values in the world. Because they put it's bold, it's colorful, it's somewhere where it can be seen. And of course, you could go down the rabbit trail of the botched Hebrew and Greek. There's a lot of them. Tattoos, people with that effort. So
it wasn't there. Wasn't there a Facebook meme that went around for a really long time of a guy who had matzah tattooed on his bicep, and he thought it meant like God or something like that?
Oh yeah, well, I met someone in Coeur d'Alene. I remember my wife and I were going out of a store, and a guy held the door for us. I'm like, thank you, and right on his forearm was a Hebrew. I'm like, that's Hebrew. And he's like, yeah. And he told me, he was all excited. He told me what it meant. And I smiled and I see you later. And I told my wife, she's like, is that what it means? I'm like, no. So I'm like, and it's like wrong. Right. And so, but I didn't tell the guy. I mean, what's that going to do? But okay. So there's
no offense to the people out there who know that they have botched, language tattoos on them.
Well,
we've all done things, whatever. Anyway,
I would say I don't understand. Here's another thing is there's people who will, look at the prophets of Baal, right? What were they doing over against Elijah, right? They were cutting themselves. What
a fantastic story.
Doing all this kind of stuff, trying to somehow express how pious they were in their worship of their false god, And so we're certainly not to look like that. And anyway, it's a great question. I would shy away from the NASB's choice to use tattoo there. I pulled it up.
Oh, in the Leviticus.
Yeah. So NASB at Leviticus 19:28 says make any tattoo marks.
Well, so does the ESV.
That might be true. But I don't know that tattoo was the same cultural meaning that we have today. Today, in America at least, it seems to be an expression of individuality and I can do whatever I want. This is my body. I don't think that's the connotation in ancient Israel. I think the idea had cultic significance. It had significance for maybe mourning the dead or some sort of ancestor cult or marking of slaves. In other words, it wasn't necessarily this, I'm this independent free spirit American and I can do with my body whatever I choose. I don't think the same morality was behind it. That's my hesitancy with this tattoo interpretation.
All right, let's move on because
good stuff. I hope that's helpful.
Let's keep going because so this is our friend Clint. I had the opportunity to meet Clint up in Ontario when I was there, and he was just him and his parents were there. Just a joy. He had come up. It was a couple weeks before his wedding, and I asked him to send me wedding photos, and he did. So it was good to see the joyous occasion.
Cool.
So congrats,
Clint.
Clint and his family. This is his question. This is an interesting question, and this might, I don't know, this could be a really quick conversation or it could be a really long one. He says, I've been pondering about the temple the past few weeks and would like to know, Rob, and your position on first century temple studies. I've noticed the last year or two some putting more emphasis on temple study, but I question how much we actually know about how things were conducted during this time. It's very good observation. It seems like most, if not all, the sources used are later or latter rabbinical source, not primary. In your research, how much do we actually know and how much is conjecture? He has a whole nother paragraph. Let's stop right there for a second. It's very astute, and one of the reasons why is because we have a lot of Hebrew rooters, Messianics, whatever you want to say, who are going around doing temple study, teaching temple workshops and all sorts of things. Should we name names? I mean, Joe Good is like is in the forefront of temple research in the Hebrew Roots movement right now. And to his credit, he's been in that position for a very long time. That's kind of been his passion. Now, what do we know about the temple? Unfortunately, most of what we know about the temple comes from the Mishnah and or later. And the Mishnah wasn't written until at least 250 years after the temple fell. So even right there, you have a huge problem. Were the writers and the compilers of the Mishnah, were they actually writing tradition that had been passed down, or were they trying to keep something alive so they kind of imagined what it might have been like? We don't know.
Right.
So that's a problem. We do have other sources. Philo talks about the temple, right? Josephus talks about the temple. And then there were other temples, believe it or not. There were other temples, one down in Egypt. that we believe,
Josephus tells us about that,
right? And and there's actual documents from that area. You know, the Passover letter is one of the letters that was written about that. We believe that they were doing sacrifices down there. But the point is that we do have other sources, and I would say sources that are probably more reliable than the Mishnah. But they really don't tell us a whole lot about what was going on. Now, Josephus does talk about the veils. He does talk about, some of the things that happened in the temple and the way that things went. So there are other sources. But I would say from just the initial first paragraph that Clint asks, I would say most of the temple, even among good scholars, most of the temple service that we have passed down to us today comes from later rabbinical sources. And whether or not it can be fully trusted or not, I am very skeptical. And this isn't to put people down who are studying in those areas. However, I think that one of the things that would really help is if the people who are studying temple service would acknowledge and recognize that what is going on in the Mishnah and later might not necessarily have actually happened in the temple. Now, I sit down on Passover, in the Passover week. I usually sit down and I try to read parts of the Mishnah on the Passover. There's a whole tractate on it. And I do that because it's interesting to see what people were saying about the Passover and about what was going on in later times. But I have to continue to remind myself this was written, hundreds of years after the temple fell. So how much of it is true? We don't know. And so if you go and see a teacher who is teaching on these things, I'd be very cautious. Ask for sources. Ask where they got the sources from. That's what I would say.
What I'm hearing you get at, Caleb, is the idea, where does fact and lore begin?
Right, exactly.
And you know what? It's not different. The same question applies to reading the Torah. Like, let's say we're all agreeing we're reading the Torah, and there's a question. Well, how old was Isaac at the Akedah? Well, the scriptures itself doesn't tell us. So now we're like, so now there's a gap, and that's where lore begins.
Right.
So rabbis have different ways of approaching that question, right? And they'll try to use clues. Well, if we assume Sarah died at that time and you do the math, it seems like he was a mature adult,
right?
Or was he just a young lad? It depends on. So in the same way that the scriptures leave gaps that our imagination could come in and create all sorts of story, the same way you can go to let's say in Israel, you go to a synagogue remains. So even now, like Professor Jody Magnus, we've talked about her many times. She has been overseeing the last several summers an excavation in Hukok, Israel, which is just northwest of the Sea of Galilee and the little hills there. And they have excavated, if you look it up, it's Hukok, Huqoq, Huqoq. Cute little town. I've actually stayed there, but I didn't. They had closed for the season. They had closed the archaeological excavation, so they had it all covered. You couldn't see it, but they have all these beautiful mosaics, right? They have mosaics of Jonah and the whale, mosaics of elephants of Alexander. They think it's maybe in the Maccabean era. They have all these synagogue floor mosaics that are slowly being cleaned out and unearthed, right, and carefully cleaned and photographed and accounted, etc. But there's still gaps, and so they try to imagine, well, what did this look like? What did the whole picture look like? And
right.
they just take what they know and they use their best guess. Okay, so in all these domains, we get to the edge of our knowledge and we try to project what we don't know to fill in the gaps. And the question that Clint asks is the same kind of question. It's like, obviously there was a temple, right? Obviously Yeshua said, you guys are not understanding here. This whole thing's going to be, toppled. And we know that, like you said, Philo writes about it. Josephus writes about it. The rabbis write about it. One example, if you just want to immerse yourself if you just want to dive into Jewish imagination of the temple from a Christian perspective, you read one of the 19th century Jewish believer in Yeshua named Alfred Edersheim, and you read his book. You can get it for free online. It's called The Temple by Alfred Edersheim. The Temple. Edersheim is Edersheim. And he draws on Josephus, Philo, the rabbis, and he just takes it all as if it's fact. They're all telling the truth,
right?
And then he uses all that information to create a backdrop for the Jesus, right? And his other book, The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah. So here you have a 19th century. So he lives in the 1800s,
right?
A Jewish person who converts to, I think it's a Church of Scotland or something. He converts to sometime in his young adulthood, and then he actually, parts of his life is in working in some sort of evangelical effort, outreach to Jews. But he produces these books, and of course you have to remember the Dead Sea Scrolls hadn't been found yet. Right. There's all manner of archaeology that hadn't been discovered. Even Masada, what we know today as Masada, wasn't on Edersheim's radar because those excavations into the Holy Land, into the land of Israel, didn't really start happening until the 20th century. And it was only then with the establishment of the State of Israel that you start to really have the institutionalization of this knowledge of like, here's where a synagogue was, here's where Masada was, here's these famous sites. And even like we were talking about Dr. Magnus, there's excavations to this day going on that give us information of the Jewish world of late antiquity that was not even in the imagination of someone in the 1800s. So long story short, I would say if you're interested in just seeing how the imagination unchecked can paint pictures of the temple, I would say go to Edersheim, read it, and recognize, though, that what you're seeing while you're reading this, what you're encountering is a scholar who is just drawing on, obviously he's super well read.
Right.
But he doesn't, it's before this kind of critical insistence on chronology and vetting sources, which sources come from what time, the care of not committing anachronism,
right,
and things like that. And so there's a tension here between a desire to be a careful scholar and the desire to just know everything we can about something, and for some reason, in God's wisdom, he has given us, he's preserved what he's preserved for us. And he, like with the Dead Sea Scrolls, who knows, maybe there will be more such libraries discovered that are somehow in a cave that still hasn't been found or unearthed. I hope so. I think that would be really cool. But we are limited. We can't just take Josephus or Philo or the rabbis on the surface there, because that's just them testifying of themselves, right? I mean, we need to have a method whereby, just like with the Torah, a matter is established by multiple witnesses,
right?
And we need to bring a multiple witness kind of method when imagining history and trying to imagine things that aren't clearly described for us in Scripture.
So. Was it you? It might have been my dad. I think it was my dad, because we were talking in the office. We were bouncing some ideas around, and my dad just made a passing comment that I've been pondering over about the temple. He said it'd be interesting to do a study of the Sadducees and what we actually know about them. He said, I'm not sure. I'd have to go look, but does the Apostolic Scriptures ever actually say that the Sadducees were the ones in charge of the temple? And he
not explicitly.
Yeah, because we get that. Where do we get that from? We get that actually from the rabbinic literature, right?
Well, we know from Josephus talks about at different times that you have he portrays initially, at least, the Sadducees and the Pharisees as political parties that are trying to get
yeah, exactly,
trying to get the ruler to be on the good side of the ruler.
Right.
So you have the history of the Maccabean kings. They're Pharisees. Then all of a sudden one rejects the Pharisees and likes the Sadducean party. Jacob Neusner wrote a book in the 70s called, he wrote hundreds of books in the 70s, I think, but one is called From Politics to Piety. And he shows how, he says the Pharisees were initially a political party, but through the Second Temple period, they slowly retreated from the hostile and power politics and just they tried to become a religion of table fellowship.
Because the reason I bring it up is because basically it seems as though the rabbinic literature used the Sadducees as a
foil.
Yeah. In other words,
as a bad guy.
This is what the Sadducees did, so that's why we're not going to do it. In other words, we don't have much of the Sadducees themselves. There is something called the Book of Doctrines, I think. There is a record of Sadducean law that is preserved in some rabbinic literature, and it's totally escaping me right now. But yeah, we know very, very little. We don't have any surviving documents of the Sadducees themselves saying we are Sadducees. And now Lawrence Schiffman, formerly of NYU, now of I think Yeshiva University, is a major voice in Dead Sea Scrolls and Second Temple Judaism. He's also an Orthodox Jew. I believe he argues that the Qumran halakha. Now, the Qumran did not use the word halakha, right?
But their traditions, their works of the law, whatever you want to call it, match Sadducean. And because they call themselves B'nai Tzadok, sons of Tzadok, that they Tzadukim, this word Tzadukim, the Tzadokites, is the source of the word Sadducee, which is right. It's from the word Tzadak, or righteousness, Tzadok. And so I don't know if I'm convinced by his argument, but if you dig into this, if you push hard enough and you start reading, you will likely encounter Dr. Schiffman's work that suggests affinity between the Qumran group and the Sadducees that split off really early, because therefore you have Sadducees in the desert, and then you still have Sadducees operating in the circles of the temple, and somehow they haven't resolved their inter-Sadducean efforts. I hope I'm not misrepresenting Dr. Schiffman's basic thesis there. I might be, but I think that's I'm probably 80% right.
I want to finish Clint's comment here. He has a whole nother paragraph that I think is worthy of looking at real quick before we finish up. He says, even if we are to presume the rabbinical literature to be telling us the truth, how much, as followers of Yeshua, could we glean from knowing this information? I've heard teachings on the red heifer sacrifice and the requirements for what qualified it to be acceptable requirements not laid out in the Torah. Yet many claim these extra requirements point to Yeshua. I'm sure you encountered the supposed miracle that took place in the temple, such as the string that turns white on Yom Kippur.
That book, reading Moses and seeing Jesus, they actually take that to be actual historical in the Talmud, and they say this proves, which is really strange coming from what I thought were academic.
Here's the thing that people don't realize. Just because false information might make your case stronger and or look better doesn't mean we should use it. Right? This happens all the time in the Hebrew roots. Well, that sounds really good.
I loved it. A couple years ago, Andre gave that great paper at Torah Resource Camp, Family Camp, on this very issue, addressing using false conceptions of the ancient Near East and Nimrod and all this to try to advance a Christian, quote, Christian agenda, and that was one of the takeaways from Andre's research there was like, look, who benefits, right? Who benefit in the long run? Even in the short run, you might think that you're gaining traction. If you really seek to honor Yeshua with every thought, word, and deed, then let's just get away from that nonsense. But you know what, Caleb? It's not always comfortable to just say, I don't know. Oh, so how often as a disciple of Yeshua do I just have to say, you know what? I don't know. Right. And I have to be okay with that. But it's at that moment of saying, I don't know, and then feeling that somehow you're weakened because you don't know. That's where the salesman's going to come in.
Right.
The snake oil salesman, because he's going to market right to that need, quote, perceived need, and he's going to sell you a solution. And that's what we see with let me tell you how to pronounce the name of God. It's in the ancient manuscripts. I can prove it. I have all manner of proof. It's just so, it's frustrating. But we have to trust. Yeshua says, my sheep hear my voice, as we have in our new awesome intro.
Right. Okay. Clinton finishes with this. Are all these extra requirements and traditions just more examples of what Yeshua was criticizing the leadership during his time on earth? The problem is that we don't know if all these extra requirements and laws were actually extant in the first century. That's number one. Number two, we need to remember, here's the problem, is that when you make it temple service, then it's binding on people. In other words, if I go into the temple and I don't do something according to the extra requirement, like the way that they want me to do it, what's going to happen? Here's the thing about tradition. I think tradition is really good. I like a lot of traditions. I have a lot of different traditions in my life. And I think my father, Tim Hegg, has many times said, if a tradition helps you come closer to God and doesn't go against Torah, but upholds Torah, then great. Okay, well, with that said, when does it become binding? When somebody walks into your congregation and a man-made tradition that your congregation has held to for a long time isn't observed, I'll tell you a quick story about, I actually went to a Presbyterian church last Sunday. I walked in and I was late. I didn't realize it. I thought it started at 8:30. It started at 8:15. So I was late. So I slip into the service, and the only seat that I could see was right down the middle aisle on the left-hand side, right on the aisle. And it was pews, it's not like individual chairs, it's pews. And so I thought, okay, I'll just slip in real quick. So I slip in and I quickly kind of go there and I sit down. I'm sitting there for about 5 minutes and I look around and I realize that, first of all, I'm the only person, I'm wearing a polo shirt. I'm the only person that doesn't have a button-up shirt and a sports jacket at that, right? People are dressed up very nicely. I also realize that I am the only person now in the entire building that is wearing a hat. So now I'm becoming self-conscious. Do I now take the hat off, knowing that I didn't do anything?
Right. I'm out of conformity with the group here.
And not only that, but I didn't do anything to my hair. I mean, normally I just take my hat off, but I knew that I had Kramer hair, right? It's sticking straight up if I take my
Jerry, let me tell you.
Yeah, exactly. And so now what do? Do I look like a total disheveled mess by, not only am I not in a suit, but also my hair will look like I just literally crawled out of bed because I did, right? Or do I leave the hat on? Well, I left the hat on. Now, I know that there were some people who were a little miffed at that. Now, as I was thinking about it, as I was leaving, and they didn't say anything to me, but I could tell. And as I was leaving, I thought, well, they probably find justification for this in 1 Corinthians,
sure,
right? In 1 Corinthians 10, and I take a different meaning than they do to that. So, okay, maybe I should have taken the hat off. But the point is that, and maybe that's not a great example because they might have, they think that they have scriptural basis in 1 Corinthians 10. But I guess my point is, or is it 11? I'm sorry, it's 11. But my point is that, if it's a man-made thing and somebody comes into the congregation, we tend to put a lot of weight and a lot of emotion into our man-made tradition. once it becomes rooted in what we do, and especially children who grow up with a tradition, you grow up with a tradition, a lot of the time you think that it's scripture, right? It's as good as scripture. You think it is scripture. It's got to be in the Bible somewhere, right? I remember seeing somebody smoke outside of a church one time, and I thought, man, why is an unbeliever at this church?
Mm. Oh, right, because
I just assumed that if you smoked, you were an unbeliever. There's no believer would smoke. What was I, 6 at the time, maybe? So the point is that we get these conceptions in our minds, and they're just traditions, and that's, I think, what Yeshua is speaking against. Oh, how you've set aside the law of God with your man-made traditions. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but the point is there that we shouldn't put. And one of the things that's kind of broken me a little bit of this is going to other communities. My father and I travel a lot. Rob and I have traveled together, to various communities and whatnot. And we're hoping to travel to more communities, right? Actually, hopefully coming up in the next couple months, we're going to be traveling to some other communities. When you go to other communities and you see how other people do things, it's a lot different than what you're used to. They do things completely differently. Even if some of the things are the same. I remember, I'll give you one more story, and then we'll get off the air. I went to a Orthodox congregation, Jewish congregation, not they weren't believers. It was in Seattle. We went, and it just happened to be a bar mitzvah that morning, and we slipped in and were sitting in the back. And I remember singing the Shema, right? And I thought, oh, good, they sing it exactly like we do. So I'm belting it out. Little did I know that you don't sing the second part of it, right? So we get to the second part of it, everybody goes dead, and I belt out the first word or two, to the tune I know. Mm-hmm. Well, this is just tradition, right?
And then you're like,
yeah, and then I'm sitting there just red as can be because, I just had a solo in front of a congregation of 600 people. But my overall point is that we as believers should.
He broke the Holocaust. Get him.
Exactly.
So that did the men in the white coats come and say?
They were gracious. Praise the Lord, they were gracious. But the point is that that's exactly what we need to be as believers. We need to give extra grace to those who and especially when it comes to tradition, is we need to be able to say, this is just tradition. It doesn't matter.
I have two. Thanks for sharing all that. This is really good. And one, to bring it back to Clint's question, I just 2 examples occurred to me. One from the Second Temple era. One is the soreg. So we know, because archaeologically we have the soreg inscription in Greek, which says, if you're a Gentile and you go past this, it's your death is on your own head. In other words,
we'll kill you.
There's a death penalty built into Herod's expansion of the Second Temple. That it's a offense that keeps non-Jews out of the certain area, and if you go beyond, it's death penalty. So we know that existed, but we know that didn't exist in Solomon's temple or in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle. So there's a tradition of man built into architecture that I'm sure Yeshua would say, yeah, that's gone, right? That's gone. Right. And Yeshua knocks over the money changing tables and basically says the same thing. He's like, this is supposed to be a house of prayer for all nations, and what you guys are doing here is a hindrance rather than a help. So there's a place where, 2 places, the soreg, and for somehow whatever the money changing tables were doing was contrary to the Torah, and Yeshua called it out. Well, on the flip side, we'll have something about back to the idea of tradition. Yeshua says grace before meals. Well, that's not commanded in the Torah,
right?
But it's a good thing. It's not like Yeshua's like, oh, I studied, like last week. All the rabbis of the Mishnah teach me to say grace before meals, therefore I need to say grace before meals. That's not it. It's not a halakhic obligation for Yeshua. For Yeshua, it's a joy,
right?
And it's just a blessing, right? And so it's a good thing, and it's real. And so so you could say, well, do I have to say grace before I eat? No, not according to Scripture. Is it a good thing to do? Absolutely, it's a good thing to do. Is it good to do it begrudgingly because you have to? No, I would say don't do it that way. So we all, as we mature, right? God wants us to grow and mature and gain wisdom and understanding and discernment about these things. And so it's good that we're talking about it.
Right.
I know that's not the perfect answer to Clint's question of like, well, where can I read the book of answers with respect to the temple? I know that he doesn't expect that. Clint, I know you don't expect that, and it's a good question. But it does. Your question confronts us with this difficulty of well, same thing. One last point on that. Imagine the Dead Sea Scroll scholars, right? They have these fragments of, let's say, the Book of Enoch,
right,
or whatever, and there's all these gaps. Well, what do?
Piece it together.
They reconstruct. They say, well, what do we know? Well, we have a Greek version that's for 500 years later. Let's try to reverse engineer and figure out what the Hebrew might have been on the places where we have the gaps. But the truth of the matter is, all we have is what we have. Right. And we want to be aware of when we're shifting from talking about what we actually have to imagining and speculating about what's not there. And that's like Yeshua says, build on rock, not on sand.
Okay. Well, it's been a good show, and we're going to be back next week with a live show again. So come back for that.
Welcome to season 6.
Welcome to season 6. Every time we get new music, I always screw up the ending. So give me grace on the next couple of shows trying to get the ending right.
Okay.
And especially with good new music.
Oh, that's right, because we got to talk while it's fading in, right?
Well, I mean, we don't have to, but it's always nice. Yeah. Keep sending us your ideas for shows and for everything, right? For your comments, your questions. Tell us what you think, what you like, what you don't like. Call us on our comment line. Shoot us emails, chag@torahresource.com. We hope that this conversation has done one thing and one thing only, to glorify our great God and Savior, Yeshua the Messiah, because Messiah matters.
Messiah matters.